Have you ever noticed someone laughing just a little too loudly at a joke that wasn't really funny? Their smile lingers a beat too long. Their eyes don't quite match the joy radiating from their mouth. You sense something beneath the surface, something that makes your own nervous system whisper a quiet warning. Something feels off, but you can't quite place what it is. Here's what's happening in that moment. You're witnessing one of the most complex psychological phenomena humans engage in daily: the deliberate construction of happiness where genuine joy doesn't exist. And before you judge that person too quickly, consider this uncomfortable truth. You've done it too. We all have. But here's where it gets disturbing. The people who fake their happiness aren't just lying to others. They're trapped in a psychological prison so sophisticated, so carefully constructed, that many don't even realize they're the ones holding the keys. They've become so skilled at manufacturing joy that they've forgotten what the real thing feels like. You see, when someone fakes happiness, they're not just putting on a performance. They're engaging in a primitive survival mechanism that rewrites their neural pathways, reshapes their relationships, and fundamentally alters how they experience reality. The brain, in its desperate attempt to maintain social connection, begins to blur the line between performance and authenticity until the person genuinely can't tell the difference anymore. Think about Sarah, a marketing executive who greets every colleague with an enthusiastic smile and an upbeat "How's your day going?" Her voice carries that perfect pitch of interest. Her body language radiates warmth, and her energy seems genuinely infectious. Everyone loves Sarah. She's the person people seek out when they need a boost, the one who lights up every room she enters. But if you watched Sarah closely, you'd notice something else. The micro expressions that flash across her face when she thinks no one is looking. The way her shoulders carry tension that doesn't match her cheerful demeanor. The slight hesitation before she launches into her usual enthusiastic greeting, as if she's mentally putting on a costume. Sarah represents millions of people who have learned that happiness is a performance requirement, not an emotional experience. She discovered early in life that her authentic feelings, particularly negative ones, created problems. Maybe her parents rewarded her bright smile and dismissed her tears. Perhaps her social circle only celebrated successes and positive attitudes. Whatever the origin, Sarah learned a crucial lesson. Happiness opens doors. Sadness closes them. Here's what's fascinating about the psychology behind this behavior. When someone consistently fakes happiness, their brain begins to treat emotion as a skill rather than an experience. They develop what psychologists call emotional labor, where feelings become work rather than authentic responses. This creates a strange paradox in their nervous system. The part of their brain responsible for genuine emotional processing starts to atrophy, while the areas dedicated to performance and social cognition become hyperactive. They become incredible at reading rooms, anticipating what others need emotionally, and delivering exactly the right response. But they lose touch with their own internal emotional landscape. You can see this in how they respond to questions about their well-being. Ask someone who chronically fakes happiness how they're really doing, and watch their face carefully. There's often a moment of genuine confusion, as if you've asked them to translate a foreign language. They've become so focused on managing others' emotional experiences that they've stopped checking in with their own. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The constant performance of happiness doesn't just exhaust these individuals. It fundamentally changes their brain chemistry. The sustained activation of their stress response system, combined with the suppression of authentic emotional expression, creates a state of chronic internal conflict. Their bodies remain in a constant state of hypervigilance, scanning for social threats while simultaneously maintaining the energy required for their happiness performance. This creates what researchers call emotional dysregulation, where the natural ebb and flow of human emotion becomes a foreign concept. Consider Marcus, a successful attorney who's built his entire career on being the optimistic, solution-focused guy everyone wants on their team. He's the one cracking jokes during high-stress depositions, maintaining unwavering confidence even when cases aren't going well, and radiating the kind of positive energy that clients find reassuring. But Marcus hasn't had a genuine moment of sadness, anger, or even authentic joy in over a decade. His emotional range has narrowed to a single note: manufactured positivity. When his father died last year, Marcus found himself comforting others at the funeral, making sure everyone else felt okay, performing grief rather than experiencing it. The psychology behind Marcus's behavior reveals something profound about how humans adapt to impossible emotional demands. His brain learned to treat authentic emotion as a luxury he couldn't afford. Every genuine feeling became a potential threat to his carefully constructed professional identity. This is where the fake happiness phenomenon becomes truly insidious. It's not just about putting on a happy face occasionally. It's about systematically training yourself out of authentic emotional experience. These individuals develop what psychologists call alexithymia, a condition where people struggle to identify and express their own emotions. But here's what makes this particularly tragic. The very happiness they're performing becomes increasingly elusive in their real experience. They become experts at creating joy for others while remaining strangers to their own capacity for genuine contentment. Watch someone who chronically fakes happiness when they think they're alone. The mask doesn't just drop, it crashes. Their face falls into an expression of profound emptiness, as if they've been holding their breath for hours and finally exhaled. Their body language shifts completely, shoulders slumping, energy deflating like a punctured balloon. This dramatic shift reveals the enormous amount of energy required to maintain their happiness performance. They're not just acting happy, they're actively suppressing every other emotional state. Anger gets buried. Sadness gets transformed into cheerfulness. Anxiety gets masked with enthusiasm, and fear gets covered with optimism. The psychological cost of this emotional labor is staggering. Their nervous systems exist in a state of constant activation, like a computer running multiple programs simultaneously. They're processing their authentic emotional responses, suppressing them, generating appropriate replacement emotions, monitoring others' reactions, and adjusting their performance accordingly. All of this happens simultaneously, creating an exhausting internal experience that feels nothing like the joy they're projecting. Here's where it gets even more complex. People who fake happiness often develop a peculiar relationship with authentic positive emotions when they do occur. Because they're so accustomed to manufactured joy, genuine happiness feels foreign, almost threatening to their established emotional patterns. When something genuinely good happens to them, they often find themselves immediately converting the authentic, positive emotion into their familiar performance mode. They can't just feel happy. They have to perform happiness, even to themselves. The spontaneous joy gets filtered through their well-practiced emotional management system until it becomes indistinguishable from their usual act. This creates a psychological prison where authentic emotional experience becomes increasingly rare. They lose the ability to simply be with their feelings without immediately converting them into socially acceptable performances. Think about Jennifer, a social media influencer whose entire brand is built around positivity and motivation. Her posts radiate confidence and joy. Her video content overflows with enthusiasm. And her engagement with followers maintains a consistently upbeat tone that's attracted hundreds of thousands of followers. But Jennifer's private experience tells a very different story. She spends hours crafting the perfect caption to accompany her smiling photos, often taking dozens of shots to capture just the right expression of spontaneous joy. Her apartment is filled with ring lights and camera equipment, turning her living space into a happiness production studio. The boundary between Jennifer's authentic self and her happiness performance has become so blurred that she genuinely doesn't know who she is without the cameras rolling. Her sense of identity has become completely entangled with her ability to generate content that makes others feel good about themselves. Here's what's particularly disturbing about Jennifer's situation. She's created a feedback loop where her livelihood depends on maintaining the happiness performance, while her psychological well-being deteriorates under the pressure of never being allowed to feel anything but positive emotions. The psychology behind this reveals how external validation can hijack our internal emotional regulation systems. When someone's sense of worth becomes dependent on their ability to make others happy, their own emotional needs become secondary considerations. They develop what researchers call other-focused emotional regulation, where their primary emotional goal is managing other people's feelings rather than attending to their own. This creates a profound disconnect from their authentic self. They become incredibly skilled at emotional attunement with others, while losing the ability to attune to their own internal experience. They can sense subtle shifts in other people's moods while remaining oblivious to their own emotional state. But here's where the story becomes even more complex. The people who are most skilled at faking happiness often attract others who are struggling emotionally. Their consistent positivity acts like a beacon for people seeking emotional support, creating relationships where they're consistently in the role of the emotional caretaker. This reinforces their pattern of prioritizing others' emotional needs over their own. They become surrounded by people who need their happiness performance, making it even more difficult to step out of the role and explore their authentic emotional experience. Consider the psychological dynamics in these relationships. The happiness performer gets validation and purpose from being needed, while never having to risk the vulnerability of authentic emotional expression. The people around them get consistent emotional support without having to reciprocate, creating an imbalanced dynamic that feels comfortable for everyone involved. But underneath this seemingly functional arrangement, both parties are missing out on genuine intimacy. The happiness performer never gets to be fully known, and their friends and Niki never get the opportunity to offer real support in return. The relationships, while appearing positive and supportive, lack the depth that comes from mutual vulnerability and authentic emotional exchange. Here's what makes this pattern particularly insidious. The happiness performer often attracts people who are drawn to their emotional stability, but these relationships reinforce their belief that their authentic emotions are burdensome or unwelcome. They learn that their value lies in their ability to maintain positivity, not in their full humanity. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle where their fear of emotional rejection gets repeatedly confirmed. They never risk showing their authentic emotional state because their relationships are built on their role as the happiness provider. The very connections that should offer emotional support instead become additional pressure to maintain their performance. The neuroscience behind chronic happiness faking reveals something profound about how our brains adapt to sustained emotional labor. When someone consistently suppresses authentic emotions while performing positive ones, their neural pathways begin to reorganize around this pattern. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation, becomes hyperactive as it constantly works to manage the gap between internal experience and external expression. Meanwhile, the limbic system, which processes authentic emotional responses, becomes less responsive over time. It's as if the brain decides that since these emotions are never allowed full expression, they're not worth the energy investment. This neurological adaptation has far-reaching consequences. The person's ability to experience the full spectrum of human emotion gradually diminishes. They don't just struggle with negative emotions. Their capacity for authentic, positive emotions also becomes compromised. Joy, when it does occur naturally, feels muted or foreign compared to their practiced happiness performances. But here's what's most devastating about this psychological pattern. The very thing these individuals fear most, being rejected for their authentic emotions, becomes more likely as their relationships become increasingly superficial. People begin to sense that something isn't quite right, even if they can't articulate what it is. The constant happiness performance creates an uncanny valley effect in relationships. Others can sense that the positivity doesn't quite ring true, but they can't pinpoint why. This creates a subtle but persistent sense of distance in their connections, ironically leading to the social rejection they were trying to avoid through their happiness performance. Think about David, a pastor who's built his entire ministry around being a source of unwavering faith and joy for his congregation. His sermons overflow with optimism. His counseling sessions focus on finding the positive in every situation, and his personal interactions radiate a confidence that God has everything under control. But David hasn't allowed himself to experience doubt, anger, or despair in over 20 years. When his own faith wavers, when he questions God's plan, when he feels overwhelmed by the suffering he witnesses in his pastoral role, he immediately converts these feelings into sermon material about finding hope in dark times. David's psychological adaptation reveals how professional roles can become emotional prisons. His identity as a spiritual leader has become so intertwined with emotional invulnerability that acknowledging his own struggles feels like a betrayal of his calling. He's trapped himself in a role where authentic human emotion becomes a professional liability. The congregation senses something in David's sermons, a quality that feels more like performance than genuine spiritual experience. His words are technically correct, his theology sound, but there's a hollowness to his delivery that suggests he's speaking about experiences he's observing rather than living. This dynamic illustrates how institutional expectations can reinforce individual tendencies toward emotional performance. David's church culture rewards unwavering faith while subtly discouraging the honest spiritual struggles that actually deepen authentic faith. He's learned that his value as a spiritual leader depends on his ability to model emotional and spiritual invulnerability. But here's what's particularly tragic about David's situation. His refusal to acknowledge his own spiritual struggles robs both him and his congregation of the deeper spiritual growth that comes from wrestling with doubt and finding authentic faith on the other side. His performance of unwavering belief prevents him from modeling the genuine spiritual journey that his congregation desperately needs to see. The psychology of recovery from chronic happiness faking involves a fundamental rewiring of how someone relates to their emotional experience. It requires learning to tolerate the discomfort of authentic feeling after years of emotional numbing through performance. The first step often involves developing what psychologists call emotional curiosity. Instead of immediately converting every feeling into a socially acceptable expression, the person learns to pause and simply notice what they're experiencing internally. This sounds simple, but for someone who's spent years in performance mode, it can feel terrifyingly vulnerable. Many people who begin this journey describe feeling like they're learning a foreign language. They have to reacquaint themselves with the subtle differences between manufactured emotions and authentic ones. They discover that real joy feels different from performed happiness, that genuine sadness carries information. Their manufactured cheerfulness was designed to suppress. The process often involves grief for the years spent disconnected from their authentic emotional experience. They mourn the relationships that were built on performance rather than genuine connection, the opportunities for real intimacy that were missed, and the parts of themselves that were sacrificed to maintain their happiness persona. But here's what makes recovery possible. The same neuroplasticity that allowed their brains to adapt to chronic emotional performance can be redirected toward authentic emotional experience. With practice, and often with therapeutic support, they can rebuild their capacity for genuine feeling and authentic connection. The journey involves learning to tolerate other people's discomfort with their authentic emotions. After years of managing everyone else's emotional experience, they must learn that it's not their responsibility to ensure others never feel uncomfortable. This represents a fundamental shift from other-focused emotional regulation to healthy, self-focused emotional awareness. Many describe this transition as terrifying and liberating simultaneously. The fear comes from losing the control and predictability that their happiness performance provided. The liberation comes from finally being able to rest, to stop the exhausting work of constant emotional management, and to discover who they are beneath the performance. Some discover that they're naturally more introverted than their extroverted happiness persona suggested. Others find that they have strong opinions and preferences that were buried beneath their people-pleasing positivity. Many are surprised to discover that their authentic personality is actually more interesting and attractive than their manufactured version. The relationships in their lives often shift dramatically during this process. Some people, particularly those who are attracted to their happiness performance, may struggle with the change and distance themselves. But others, often those who sensed the inauthenticity all along, move closer and express relief at finally meeting the real person. Here's what's most profound about this recovery process. As people reconnect with their authentic emotional experience, they often discover that their capacity for genuine happiness actually increases. The joy they experience becomes richer, more textured, and more satisfying than anything they achieved through performance. They learn that authentic happiness isn't a constant state, but rather moments of genuine contentment that arise naturally from living in alignment with their values and authentic selves. These moments feel completely different from the manufactured positivity they used to generate on demand. The irony is striking. By giving up their desperate pursuit of constant happiness, they become capable of experiencing real joy. By allowing themselves to feel sadness, anger, and fear, they create space for genuine positive emotions to emerge naturally. Recovery also involves developing what researchers call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between subtle variations in emotional experience. Instead of the binary happy or performing happy that characterized their previous emotional life, they develop a rich vocabulary for their internal experience. They learn the difference between contentment and excitement, between disappointment and despair, between concern and anxiety. This emotional sophistication allows them to respond more appropriately to their circumstances and to communicate their needs more effectively in relationships. Perhaps most importantly, they develop emotional resilience that their happiness performance never provided. When difficult emotions arise, they can sit with them, learn from them, and allow them to pass naturally, rather than immediately suppressing them with manufactured positivity. This authentic emotional processing actually makes them more effective at supporting others who are struggling. Instead of rushing to fix or cheer up people who are experiencing difficult emotions, they can offer genuine presence and understanding. Their support becomes more helpful because it's rooted in authentic empathy rather than performed encouragement. The transformation often surprises them with its ripple effects. Their work performance may improve as they bring more genuine energy and creativity to their tasks. Their physical health often improves as their nervous system finally gets relief from the constant stress of emotional performance. Their sleep improves as they no longer carry the exhaustion of all-day emotional labor. But perhaps the most profound change is in their sense of self. For the first time in years, maybe decades, they begin to feel like they know who they really are. The constant question of, am I being authentic, that plagued them during their performance years, gets replaced with a quiet confidence in their genuine responses to life. They discover that people are drawn to authenticity in ways they never expected. The vulnerability they feared would drive others away actually creates deeper connections than their happiness performance ever achieved. They learn that being real is more attractive than being perfect, that being human is more compelling than being invulnerable. You see, the psychology of people who fake their happiness reveals something profound about the human condition. We're all walking around with parts of ourselves that we believe are unacceptable, emotions we think we're not allowed to feel, aspects of our personality we're convinced would drive others away if discovered. The people who get trapped in happiness performances are often the most sensitive among us, the ones who picked up on the subtle message that their authentic selves weren't quite right. They became experts at emotional camouflage because they cared so deeply about connection that they were willing to sacrifice authenticity to maintain it. But here's what they discover in recovery, and what we all need to understand. The connections we build on performance are ultimately unsatisfying because they require us to remain unknown. The very intimacy we're seeking becomes impossible when we're not willing to be seen fully. The people who fake their happiness are not weak or deceptive. They're survivors who developed sophisticated coping mechanisms to navigate a world that often punishes authentic emotional expression. Their recovery involves not just changing their behavior, but healing the wounds that made the performance feel necessary in the first place. Understanding this psychology matters because we all exist somewhere on this spectrum. We all have moments where we perform emotions we don't feel, where we suppress authentic responses to maintain social harmony. The difference is often just a matter of degree and circumstance. The path forward involves creating spaces, both for ourselves and others, where authentic emotional expression is not just tolerated, but welcomed. It means learning to value genuine connection over comfortable predictability, real intimacy over performed harmony. When we encounter someone whose happiness feels just a little too perfect, whose positivity never wavers, whose cheerfulness seems immune to life's inevitable difficulties, we might remember that behind that performance is someone who learned that their authentic self wasn't safe to share. They're not trying to deceive us. They're trying to survive in the only way they know how. And in recognizing their struggle, we might also recognize our own smaller versions of the same pattern. The ways we edit ourselves to be more palatable, the emotions we suppress to avoid discomfort, the parts of our authentic experience we keep hidden to maintain our social connections. The invitation is always there, for them and for us, to risk being real, to discover what happens when we show up as we actually are, rather than as we think we should be. To find out if the acceptance we're seeking might actually be waiting on the other side of our willingness to be authentically, imperfectly, courageously human.